Hey everybody, and welcome back to Investing with Wesley. In my previous episodes where I talked to you about how we can anticipate a economic recession or depression, I always link back to the Great Depression and that historical chart. And a lot of you have been asking a very valid question. This country's economy has had various different depressions. Why do I keep going back to that one when it was so far away? And the answer to that question is very simple. What we see going on today is almost identical to what we see back then, with just a couple differences. Now, the question's also been asked, will this depression be worse than the Great Depression? Because a lot of different fearmongers here on YouTube will have you tell you that this Great Depression is going to have everything fall 80-90%. And in today's episode, we're going to dive in and help you determine yourself whether you think that's possible or not. Let's get into it. Okay, so for starters, what even is a depression? Now, a lot of you will think that a depression is when the stock market tumbles significantly. And although that usually does happen in a depression, technically a depression is just the economic output of a government stalling or going down for an extended period of time. So, since depressions are very closely related to the economic output of a country, let's throw up a 20-year economic output graph of the United States. As you can see here, from 2000 up until the present, there is two different trend lines. The first trend line is our economic output prior to the 2008 housing market crash. Now, after that, we in a sense restarted and regrew, but you can see that that secondary trend line just wasn't as sharp as the first one. So if you extended the first trend line all the way out until 2022, you could actually see that had we continued on the same trajectory to begin with, our GDP growth would have been about $3 trillion more than it currently is. Now, this one particular 12-year trend line, from the housing market crash to the crash caused by the pandemic, you could see that in this 12-year period, the GDP, or the economic output of our country, grew at about 22%. Now, extending this graph to account for the full 20 years, you can see that the GDP grew about 47%. Now, these numbers are important because when we reference the Great Depression era graph, you'll be able to see the difference. All right, so this next graph I have on screen is the Great Depression era. It is 20 years from 1930 to 1950. But there's one thing very different that you might be able to notice in this graph compared to our current economic growth graph that we just saw a moment ago. In this Great Depression era graph, using that same 12-year period, you could see that the economic growth from their crash is about 63%. Whereas if you extend the entire graph to the full 20 years like we did last time, their GDP actually doubled. Their GDP over 20 years grew 100%. So comparing the two, you could see that even in the Great Depression, the most historical depression that this country has ever had, there was still economic growth. Now, you might be arguing that because of World War I and all the federal spending that the government did then, that caused this economic boom or economic growth. And although that's a fair argument, you can't tell me that during the COVID pandemic, all the government spending on stimulus packages and so on didn't equate to potentially even more federal spending. And although back then it was calculated very differently, if you adjust the calculations to today's model, the unemployment rate during the Great Depression versus the unemployment rate during the height of the pandemic were roughly the exact same. These are two giant reasons as to why I go back to the Great Depression graph, is because the economic output as far as spending goes by the government, as well as the unemployment output, are very, very similar. So you might be asking yourself, well, if in the Great Depression we still had a growth of GDP, even so much as 100% within 20 years, what's going on nowadays? Well, now there's no doubt about it, we are absolutely falling behind. And even though we've experienced a small correction recently in the stock market, we're still at all-time highs. So these two examples really help to show that we don't need to have a slump in the stock market in order to be in the middle of a depression. You could instead have an inflationary depression where the stock prices of everything around us and the nominal monetary growth grow over time, but the actual economic output stalls. A perfect example of this is Venezuela. Their stock markets are at all-time highs and their monetary output are at all-time highs as well, but they have almost zero economic growth, and actually if you look at a chart, it's even nosediving. And this is because of all the money printing and the hyperinflation that they're experiencing right now. Hyperinflation and all the printing of money is causing their monetary amount to skyrocket. Inflation always does good for the stock market, so their stock markets are at all-time high, but their actual contribution, what they're producing, is nosediving. To help you understand better, I want you to understand a big ball of stuff, and how much access you have to that stuff depends on how well off as a country we are doing. Or in other words, the standard of living. Now, the average Joe making $50,000 or $60,000 a year will have access to about half of this stuff. The rich people have access to 100% of this stuff. Now, in the Great Depression, there was plenty of stuff to go around, but no one had any money to purchase the stuff. In an inflationary depression similar to the one in Venezuela, there is plenty of money to go around. They're printing billions and trillions of it. There's just no stuff for that money to buy. So even the average Joe and the extremely wealthy with a lot of money still end up poorer because the access they have to all this stuff is dwindling, not because their money is dwindling, but because the stuff itself is dwindling. Now, like I already mentioned, a depression is directly related to the standard of living, how much stuff you have access to. But it doesn't just mean consumerized stuff. The standard of living goes in every direction. And in times of depression, the standard of living drastically goes down. And you could argue that we're actually already in a depression. It's just not an economic depression yet. In a depression, 5 things are bound to happen. They happen in every single depression. Homelessness rises, drug use goes up, life expectancy goes down, actual emotional depression cases go up, and fertility and birth rates go down. Whenever there is an economic depression, all 5 of those things happen. And most of it is because the standard of living goes down during a depression. Now, throwing up a bunch of different images will have you see that all 5 of those things that I've just mentioned are currently already happening. Homeless rates are going up, life expectancy is going down, fertility and birth rates are going down, depression cases are going up, same with drug uses. All these things are actively happening as we speak. The only thing that's different is our economic output remains steady. Not steadily growing, but also not falling. It is stagnant. The pandemic has all our factories and all our workers domestically shut down, so we're not actually producing any GDP or any products. Likewise, all of our ports are closed and have a massive backlog, so all the supplies that we're importing can't get to shelf. Because of all the inflation, because of all the stimuluses, we have the money. We just don't have access to the stuff. And that is why pretty soon I think the markets are going to catch up with the real economy, and we're going to see the markets tank as well. Now, I don't want to end this on doom and gloom and something depression-like, so I just want to tell you that depressions and market corrections happen all the time. And I highly recommend that because we are in an inflationary environment that could cause a depression, you need to stay invested. Don't sell. You could very well see some losses in your account. But as the market falls and the Federal Reserve reprints more and more money, all this inflation is going to pump up the prices of the market. So you could either keep everything in a savings account or cash and then be victim of hyperinflation just like the people of Venezuela, or you could leave your money invested, invest some more, and as that money grows in the stock market, it will hopefully outpace the rate of the inflation. That is the only way to keep your money and the value that it has actually worth something. Secondly, I want to say diversify. Diversify out of this country as well. Everyone knows it's foolish to have all your money in one basket. And even if you diversify really well across the United States, if the United States economy fails, then all your eggs are still in that one basket. Diversify across a bunch of different sectors as well as a bunch of different economies. Invest in Europe, invest in Japan, China, so on and so forth. Get your money out there and have it grow. And obviously you're not going to experience these great returns that you could if you just went YOLO all in on one particular stock. But safe, consistent growth is always better than losing it all in an economic depression. I hope you got value in this video. If you did, please remember to hit that like button, as it really helps this channel get out there. I have a dedicated Facebook and Instagram account, so if you ever wanted to reach me out there, feel free to. Either way though, the choice is yours, and I'll see you in the next episode.